我宣布
The 9,117th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and the Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Geir Patterson, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Ms. Joyce Mitsuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. I should like to extend, on behalf of the Council, a warm welcome to the new Permanent Representative of Ireland to the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Fergal Meathan. We look forward to cooperating closely with him and wish him every success. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2022/635, the report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2139, 2165, 2191, 2258, 2332, 2393, 2401, 2449, 2504, 2533, 2585, and 2642. I now give the floor to Mr. Geir Patterson.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Let me start by informing you that Deputy Special Envoy Najat Roshdi has joined my team this month and hit the ground running. I look forward to working closely with her. Mr. President, I have since early 2020 stressed that front lines have been frozen, and I have urged that this relative calm provided a window to build a credible political process. However, this opportunity has so far not been seized. And I am worried that we have in recent months seen troubling signs of military escalation on several axes. This last month alone saw an increase in strikes attributed to a wide range of actors. On 11 August, the SDF publicly acknowledged killing Turkish soldiers on the border inside Turkish territory, stating that these strikes were in response to an escalation in Turkish drone and artillery strikes. Turkey has reiterated its security concerns and made renewed statements threatening further military intervention inside Syria. Syrian state media said that the government carried out strikes on Turkish and armed opposition sites inside Syria in response to what it said were Turkish strikes on 16 August that targeted and killed Syrian government soldiers near Ain al-Arab. Strikes on al-Hasake on 18 August caused civilian casualties, including women and children. On 19 August, strikes hit a crowded market in Al-Bab, causing significant civilian casualties, including women and children. And on 22 August, there were reports of a round of pro-government airstrikes in Idlib with ongoing mortar, rocket, and artillery exchanges across front lines, causing a rise in civilian casualties. On 23 and 24 August, US strikes targeted what they said were Iranian-backed groups and their infrastructure in Deir ez-Zor, in what it says was a response to 2 attacks on sites where US forces are present in Al-Tanf and Deir ez-Zor. August saw further airstrikes in Tartus, Damascus, and Hama, which Syrian state media attributed to Israel and said killed several Syrian government soldiers. Meanwhile, there was an escalation in the southwest, including tit-for-tat security incidents, a Syrian government offensive in Tafas, and infighting in Shreya. And, Mr. President, listed terrorist groups continued to launch attacks on government, SDF, and other forces. Mr. President, these are just some of the recent incidents of particular note. I am concerned that an escalatory cycle could see events further unravel, with civilians continuing to pay an already immense cost. And international peace and security will be at risk, given the international nature of many of these latest clashes. I take note of the various diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation. I hope that these different efforts can unite to restore the calm across Syria towards a nationwide ceasefire, something which we will underline to ceasefire task force participants here in Geneva. And of course, a ceasefire will also require parallel efforts to address the extensive presence of listed terrorist groups in a cooperative manner that is in line with international law and which protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Meanwhile, the members of the Humanitarian Task Force here in Geneva were extensively briefed last Friday on action needed to support humanitarian priorities on the ground, more relevant than ever, given that military escalation will only increase needs and inhibit humanitarian access. Let me also note that the continued support of all members of the Council for the implementation of all aspects of Security Council Resolution 2642 is important via all modalities, whether cross-border or cross-line, and with support for early recovery. And let me remind you that any humanitarian effects of sanctions that could exacerbate the plight of ordinary Syrians need to be avoided and mitigated, particularly in terms of over-compliance. Mr. President, we need a political process that moves steadily forward, and we do not have that at present. Last month, I briefed you in detail on why plans for a 9th session of the small body of the Constitutional Committee are temporarily on hold. In Moscow last week, I met Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who assured me that Russia remains focused on Syria and expressed support for advancing the work of the Constitutional Committee. We agreed to continue discussions to resolve the issues that are preventing the holding of a 9th session. I also had direct communications from Iranian Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian and interactions with senior Turkish officials. I appreciate these engagements. It is my hope that the committee will soon be able to reconvene in Geneva. But, Mr. President, let's be frank. The key challenge facing the committee is not the venue, but the lack of progress on substance. I reiterated my appeal to Minister Lavrov, already conveyed to him and the foreign ministers of Iran and Turkey, ahead of the Astana Format Summit in Tehran on 19th July, to support the co-chairs in ensuring political will, a faster pace, and better working methods. This is how the committee could become credible. This is how it could fulfill its mandate and become a door opener for a wider political process. Mr. President, we also need to move on a broader process on the many other aspects of Resolution 2254. A series of step-for-step confidence-building measures could help unlock progress and build a more safe, calm, and neutral environment, if done with precision and in a coordinated manner within the framework of the UN process. Mr. President, I have nothing new to report to you on the Syrian presidential amnesty decree of 30th April. I look forward to further engagement with the Syrian government on this decree and the other areas for confidence-building measures that I have raised with them. I have continued to work with outside players to be ready to meet a real step with a real step. I appeal to the Syrian government not to miss this opportunity to make progress via its own sovereign moves. This was my message to Minister Lavrov in Moscow too, who took note of the initiative. Mr. President, let me add a note on the critical issue of missing persons, an enduring source of suffering for tens of thousands of individuals from all over Syria who remain arbitrarily detained, abducted, or forcibly disappeared. Their families have the right to know the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones. The Secretary General will shortly release a study commissioned by the General Assembly that points the way forward by proposing pathways to fulfill the family's right to know the truth. I also wish to inform you that we are convening the Women's Advisory Board in Switzerland this week, whose members continue to present insightful analysis and remind us of the imperative role women play in preserving the resilience of the Syrian society. The Civil Society Support Room also continues its valuable work, with meetings planned soon for 2 new thematic working groups so that the spectrum of Syrian experts can make substantive contributions to the political process. Mr. President, we clearly face mounting challenges in implementing Resolution 2254. I regret that we have not taken advantage of over 2 years of relative calm to advance the process further. We need relative calm to be restored, and we need to work towards a nationwide ceasefire. We will continue to work intensely to resolve issues and resume the Constitutional Committee in Geneva, and we will continue to look for opportunities for step-for-step confidence-building measures while paying special attention to the file of the detained, the abducted, and the missing. But, Mr. President, we need to be honest about the mismatch between the scale of our collective political efforts and the scale of the challenge at hand. The degree of fragmentation in Syria, the region and internationally, and deficits of trust and will are preventing us from doing what needs to be done. Addressing this conflict in a comprehensive manner with serious compromise and investment involving all players. I will continue to remind you that this is the only way to avoid another dangerous collapse. This is the only way to reunite and repair a fragmented country and people, to genuinely restore Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity, to end the displacement crisis, and to allow the Syrian people to chart their own future. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Patterson for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Echoing Gear, I'm also deeply alarmed by the recent increase in violence in northern Syria, including in the northern Aleppo countryside and northeast Syria. Drone strikes and shelling have resulted in civilian casualties. An attack in Al-Hasakeh on 18th August claimed the lives of 4 civilian women and girls, and an attack on a market in Al-Bab city on the 19th of August reportedly killed 13 civilians, including 4 boys and 1 girl. The lives of these Syrian children were wiped out or forever altered. Violence breeds fear of more violence, and both make people flee. As we hear renewed statements and read reports about preparations for a possible military operation in northern Syria, displacement is already happening. Violence is also impeding our ability to operate. The cross-line mission to Ras Al-Ain was postponed due to increased hostilities despite all the necessary approvals and preparation. Again, I want to remind all the parties to this conflict that international humanitarian law requires them to respect civilians and civilian objects and to take constant care to spare them throughout their military operations. I strongly appeal to the members of the Council to ensure respect for the rules of war and accountability for serious violations. Mr. President, this year alone, at least 26 murders have been reported at Al-Hol camp, including those of 20 women, and we continue to receive reports of sexual violence, some perpetrated by the camp's guards. In addition, humanitarian partners have reported an increase in sexual exploitation cases. If hostilities escalate in northern Syria, there will likely be a negative impact on the protection of people in Al-Hol camp, where the security situation is already extremely bad. Security challenges in the camp may further compromise the grim situation, and women and girls especially will be at even greater risk. Humanitarian organizations' movements to the camp and to the neighboring areas could be further restricted, disrupting emergency and essential services. Al-Hol residents and the humanitarian partners working to assist them need more protection, safety, and security. Let me call once again on all member states involved to take urgent action and fulfill their responsibility to repatriate their citizens through all available routes. Opportunities for durable solutions for the people in Al-Hol do exist. For example, on the 12th of August, the government of Iraq repatriated 151 families, mainly female-headed households and highly vulnerable people, to Jeddah 1 in Nineveh Governorate. And 73 internally displaced families left Al-Hol on 14th of August, returning to various areas in Syria's Dar ez-Zor. Mr. President, Syria's economic crisis continues to affect civilians across the country. FAO reported that last month's wheat harvest in Syria was one of the lowest on record, and the second failed wheat harvest in 2 years. Fuel shortages and radically reduced access to electricity are having a crippling effect on the population, eroding livelihood opportunities and severely limiting access to essential services. This is exacerbated by the water crisis across the country which is affecting access to sufficient and safe drinking water and irrigation, as well as water to produce food and generate power. As always, the economic crisis disproportionately affects women, girls, boys, and people with disabilities, particularly their mobility and their access to basic services, including to reproductive health and protection services. The United Nations continues to promote more funding for early recovery and resilience. At least 26% of the overall request for humanitarian assistance in Syria aims to implement early recovery and resilience programs. This is critical to enable Syrians to rebuild their lives with dignity. At least 228 projects have received US $333 million to implement early recovery and resilience activities, representing 30% of the funds requested. And at least 51 of these projects contribute to providing electricity to support basic services, including water and sanitation, nutrition, health, and education. It is worth noting here that overall funding to Syria's humanitarian response plan currently stands at only 24% of the requested funds. The biggest challenge for aid agencies right now is funding, while the needs are increasing and will further increase as winter is coming. I want to call for greater solidarity and increased humanitarian funding from the international community, especially to early recovery and livelihood programs. Funding of mine action programs, especially clearance, is critical. Progress has been made. Since December, over 1 million square meters of agricultural land has been cleared in rural Damascus. Increased funding to scale up such programs are needed. Mr. President, let me turn to an update on humanitarian access. The United Nations continues to do everything in its power to make progress on cross-line assistance to all parts of Syria. In the northwest, the 6th cross-line mission to Samarda in Idlib Governorate was completed on the 4th and 5th of August. I urge all concerned parties to expand these operations by allowing multiple cross-line convoys each month and increasing the number of trucks in each convoy. Mr. President, the United Nations and partners still do not have humanitarian access to people in Rukban. We remain deeply concerned about these people as they have limited access to essential food items, water, healthcare, and other basic services. We remain committed to reach these people, but we need full access to assess their humanitarian needs and provide regular humanitarian assistance. We also need the necessary access and security conditions to support people who wish to leave the camp in a principled, voluntary, and informed manner. The humanitarian community is planning a multi-sectoral response that includes vaccinations. I call on all parties to support this plan and facilitate immediate humanitarian access and assistance to people in the camp. Mr. President, late last month, I visited Gaziantep and Hatay in Turkey to review the cross-border humanitarian response in light of the Security Council resolution. I witnessed the large scale of the operation and the high level of scrutiny applied. I also heard from affected women in Idlib about the dismal humanitarian conditions in northwest Syria. They told me that they need support to get back on their feet, what we technically call early recovery programs, and that they need better access to education for their children. Over the coming months, the United Nations will do its utmost to facilitate the implementation of all aspects of Resolution 2642. But to make this happen, we need the support of all parties. We need meaningful resources, and we need sustained, regular, and predictable access. I am very concerned at the irreversible damage caused by chronic underfunding. It could compromise life-saving assistance and curtail investments in livelihood and essential services. Lack of funding comes with severe consequences, including more dropouts from school, higher malnutrition rates, and less protection interventions. If we do not act now, a generation of Syrian children might be lost. It is critical that this Council shares responsibility for humanitarian's life-saving work in Syria. And I want to remind all parties of their obligation to facilitate rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians in need across Syria. I call on all parties to facilitate access across all response modalities so that assistance can reach those in need. And this brings me to my last point. While we need your support today, we'll need it even more in the coming months as winter approaches and our response shifts gears. We know the Syrian winter will bring more hardship, and we remain determined to assist people everywhere we can. We count on your support to stay the course. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Nisuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Assistant Secretary General Masuya, for your briefings today. Your reports about the lack of progress in addressing the Syrian political situation, as envisioned in Resolution 2254, and the further deteriorating humanitarian crisis should obligate this Council to come together to hold the Assad regime accountable for the decade of war it has waged and its ongoing violations of international law. Yet, Council unity on Syria is impossible due to one member who repeatedly puts its narrow interests and those of the Assad regime ahead of peace, stability, and Syrians' ever-growing humanitarian needs. The United States remains concerned with the unfounded and unnecessary delays to advancing the Constitutional Committee's process, and the United States calls for an immediate resumption of the committee's work. Delays prolong and increase the suffering of the Syrian people through no fault of their own. Russia has repeatedly told this Council that the political process in Syria must be Syria-owned and Syrian-led. We agree. Yet Russia is not practicing what it preaches by holding up the Constitutional Committee due to its own bilateral concerns, which have nothing to do with Syria. Further, the United States reminds this Council and the Assad regime that there is more to Resolution 2254 than just the work of the Constitutional Committee. The regime should also be pursuing a nationwide ceasefire and securing the release of all arbitrarily detained persons in an organized and humane manner. If the Syrian regime is serious about political resolution, the United States and the international community needs to see concrete steps to demonstrate that it is following through on its announcement of amnesty, for example, by announcing where and under what conditions it released individuals from prison, or issuing lists of names of individuals released and granted amnesty. These tasks should continue no matter the status of the Constitutional Committee. We urge the Assad regime to make progress immediately on these important tasks. The Special Envoy mentioned the U.S. airstrikes last week. As the United States stated in its letter to the Council dated August 26th, on August 24th, the United States undertook precision strikes against a facility in eastern Syria, a facility used by militia groups affiliated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This action was in response to armed attacks against the United States and was taken in the exercise of the United States' inherent right of self-defense, as reflected in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. On August 15th, 2022, Iran-backed militia groups had attacked U.S. forces at 2 locations in Syria. These attacks followed a series of attacks by Iran-backed militia groups on U.S. forces and facilities in Iraq and Syria throughout 2022, and even before, all of which have threatened the lives of U.S. and coalition personnel. The United States military action was taken to protect and defend the safety of our personnel, to degrade and disrupt the ongoing series of attacks against the United States and our partners, and to deter the Islamic Republic of Iran and Iran-backed militia groups from conducting or supporting further attacks on U.S. personnel or facilities. The United States also calls for immediate de-escalation in northern Syria. We remind all parties that they have an interest in stability and security. We remain deeply concerned about the destabilizing impact military activity has on this region, including mass civilian displacement and on our efforts to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. As we seek to build peace in Syria, it is as important as ever that we work to implement Resolution 2254 in an authentic and an enduring way. We urge all members of this Council, as well as the Assad regime, to work diligently to implement these important efforts and make progress towards peace, as well as to facilitate humanitarian access to the Syrian people, including through the cross-border mechanism we authorized in UN Security Council Resolution 2642. So far this fiscal year, the United States has given nearly $900 million in humanitarian aid to the Syrian people, with nearly $15 billion given since the start of the crisis. Our humanitarian aid includes early recovery programs across the whole of Syria. These programs help Syrians access livelihoods and basic services, therefore reducing their dependence on external aid. The United States has long supported early recovery efforts across all parts of Syria, but we remain opposed to reconstruction in regime areas without authentic and enduring progress toward a political solution. There was broad support within this Council for a full 12-month reauthorization of life-saving aid through the renewal of this vital cross-border mechanism. Yet, due to Russia's obstruction and its imposition of a truncated 6-month duration, Syrian families and humanitarians already fear what January might bring. They are stockpiling for the upcoming harsh winter, worried aid may be cut off just as the cold and the snow descend. The United States welcomes the 14 truckloads of aid that moved across line from Aleppo to Idlib on August 4th, just as we welcome the more than 800 truckloads of aid moving through the Bab el-Hawa crossing into Syria each month. The United States supports humanitarian access to all Syrians in need through all modalities. The Assad regime and Russia cannot say the same. The regime and its Russian backers continue to block cross-line aid when it suits their cynical aims, including aid to the people of Tel Abyad, Ras El Ain, and Rukban. They continue to prevent baby formula and medicines from reaching the people of northeast Syria. And they continue to impede humanitarian access and independent monitoring in areas under regime control. Why else would the regime in Russia wish to end UN cross-border aid, if not to subjugate the people of northwest Syria in the same way. In conclusion, Mr. President, the cross-border mechanism provides a critical lifeline of assistance. We urge all security members to support and strengthen humanitarian access, both cross-line and cross-border. Ultimately, we reiterate that the only way to end this dire humanitarian crisis is through a credible, inclusive political process as described in Resolution 2254. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the United States for his statement. Now I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we are grateful to Geir Pedersen and Madam Joyce Masuya for the overview of the political and humanitarian situation in Syria. We are convinced that establishing long-term stability and security in Syria is only possible through full restoration of the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, and the cessation of illegal foreign military presence. In this connection, we strongly condemn the continuing airstrikes of the Israeli Air Force on various targets in Syria. Just over the past month, the Syrian port of Tartus has frequently been subject to Israeli strikes, as a result of which Syrian soldiers were killed. Now, the occupation of part of the territory of Syria and the strikes on its territory by the United States also belongs in the same category of violations. The latest such flagrant incidents took place last week. The U.S. openly recognized this by publishing a letter to the Security Council. Such illegitimate and irresponsible actions are a gross violation of the fundamental norms of international law and should be stopped. Furthermore, in addition to this factor, the threat of security to Syria and for the whole region are related to the continuing hotbeds of terrorism, which have found refuge on territory that is not under control of Damascus, in Idlib, the Euphrates region, and At-Ta'ib. Against this background, what's really necessary right now is the Syrian political process. In this context, we conducted extensive consultations with Geir Pedersen, during which we confirmed the need to continue direct intra-Syrian dialogue with the support of the UN in the framework of Resolution 2254. We are interested in progress on issues of the Syrian peace process based on the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and decisions which were adopted at the Congress of Syrian National Dialogue in Sochi in 2018. It's very important for the Constitutional Committee to meet regularly, and what's particularly important, to meet in optimal conditions. That is not a bilateral issue, as our American colleagues suggested. We will continue to contribute to furthering the work of the Constitutional Committee so that the Syrians themselves, without external interference, can reach agreement on constitutional reform. In this context, we'd like to note the importance of the Astana format, which has confirmed its role as the most effective international mechanism to assist in achieving long-term normalization in Syria. Before the end of the year, we hope to conduct another meeting of this format in the city of Nur Sultan. Mr. President, as far as the humanitarian dimension, we'd like to just mention the fact that the UN is beginning to acknowledge the destructive consequences of illegal Western sanctions for the development of Syrian economy, and note the quickly worsening food security situation in the country. We're talking about the latest report of the WFP, the FAO hunger hotspots. We note with alarm the information of the UN on the record low wheat harvests in Syria. There's no need to explain the importance of the production of bread in the diet of Arab countries. In this context, we'd like to draw your attention to the report called Access to Electricity and Humanitarian Needs. In that report, sanctions are mentioned among the factors preventing the reestablishment of electrical supply in Syria, bearing in mind that Resolution 2642 expanded the area of recovery projects and now includes ensuring stable electrical energy to facilities of critical infrastructure. Bearing that in mind, the maintaining of sanctions will undermine UN efforts to fulfill its humanitarian mandate, and we believe that no one should be interested in that. It is clear that without fundamental resolving of the essential issue of sanctions against Damascus, we risk seeing the in the near future the tragic consequences of the ill-thought-out Western sanctions, which are supposedly protecting so-called liberal values. Against this backdrop, it's even more shocking are the demonstrative easing of sanctions on territories not under control of Damascus and the continuing looting by the United States of agricultural and oil resources of Syria. We see this as an intention to maintain the fragmentation of the country. As far as the cross-line humanitarian deliveries, we must agree with the Secretary General about the need to expand such efforts in the context of Idlib. As is mentioned in the report of Antonio Guterres, similar deliveries to the Euphrates region continued over the past 2 years, which means that where there's good faith among the sides, supplying all regions of Syria through internal Syrian routes is possible. This became fully evident after the closure of the Yarubia border crossing point. No matter what stories were about the supposedly tragic consequences of this step we heard from our Western colleagues, experience shows the opposite. We continue to look forward to tangible progress here in the upcoming 6 months. However, reports we're receiving about the fact that fighters from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are once again threatening not to allow Syrian students to resume their university studies on government-controlled territory. This gives us grounds for alarm that they will create obstacles for humanitarian workers as well. We call on all sides not to allow any undermining of UN efforts to establish stable humanitarian deliveries to Sarmada. Now, we place great hopes also regarding the ending of cross-border assistance. On this point, I'd like to say to our colleagues that, well, if our colleagues, Western colleagues first and foremost, will fulfill what they promised in the resolution about cross-border assistance, then there's no need to worry about the extension of that resolution. We place great hopes on the upcoming in September first round of informal interactive dialogue, and we hope to see a frank, non-politicized discussion, as well as a substantive contribution from the UN. We noted with interest in the Secretary General's report updated information on early recovery projects. Compared to the previous reporting period, the number of projects financed by donors in early recovery has increased from 133 to 288. We'd like to discuss this issue in detail in September. We also believe it's important to have a substantive discussion on Syrian refugees. They have become a heavy burden for host countries who are forced inter alia to tolerate the presence of former white helmets, which have been recognized as radicals even in the West, and their patrons in the United States and Canada, in spite of their earlier assurances, have refused to welcome them because their involvement in terrorism is just too obvious. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
And thank you for your warm welcome this morning. I am honoured to join you all at this table, and I look forward to working with you in the coming months to progress the vital work of this Council. I delivered a statement today on behalf of Norway and Ireland as co-pen holders on the Syria humanitarian file. Many thanks to you, ASG Msuya, for your briefing today. As ever, the severe need of those on the ground is clear. Humanitarian needs are at their highest ever levels, and civilians continue to suffer due to armed conflict and violence. 87 civilians, including 25 children, died between the 1st of June and the 25th of July as a result of hostilities. It is deeply disturbing that many of the attacks resulting in these deaths appear to target civilians or to take place near locations of a civilian character. We call on all parties to comply with international humanitarian law, including the prohibition on indiscriminate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions to avoid harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. We commend the UN and its partners for their considerable work across all 14 governorates in a challenging humanitarian landscape. We welcome progress on early recovery and the commitment shown to continue in this regard, including the 51 projects that contribute to the provision of electricity to support basic services. Almost 1.7 million people benefited directly and indirectly from early recovery and resilient efforts in June and July. This important work must continue. As co-pen holders, Ireland and Norway strongly support the use of all modalities to deliver aid to the millions of Syrians in desperate need. We welcome the completion of the 6th cross-line delivery earlier this month. We encourage continued progress on cross-line missions and again commend OCHA and other UN agencies for their significant efforts in this regard. We reiterate the call for all parties to support cross-line deliveries, including by providing timely security guarantees. Soaring food prices, magnified by global inflation rates and the economic crisis, have exacerbated food insecurity. It is extremely concerning that WFP has been forced to reduce rations to less than 1,200 calories per person in northwestern Syria and to below 1,000 calories in other areas. Increased funding is urgent, not only to expand the vital work of the UN and NGOs, but to maintain the life-saving assistance currently in place. Soaring heat and critically low water supply are placing lives at risk. Civilian access to water is curtailed in numerous areas, and a lack of irrigation is threatening crop production as well as seeds for next year's yield, exacerbating already significant food insecurity. We knew that this season would come, just as we know that winter will present further fatal challenges. When Resolution 2642 allows the vital work of the cross-border mechanism to continue for 6 months, it is imperative that this Council confirms the decision to further extend its mandate. The cross-border mechanism remains a critical, irreplaceable lifeline for millions. As co-pen holders, Norway and Ireland will continue to be guided by the deep humanitarian needs of the people of Syria. The Council must work together with addressing these needs as our focus. Mr. President, I will now focus on the political situation and make a statement in my national capacity. Firstly, I wish to thank Special Envoy Pedersen for his briefing. Ireland is seriously concerned about the continuing escalation of hostilities in northern Syria. We are appalled by the attack on the 18th of August in Al-Hasaka that killed 4 women and girls and injured 11 others, and the attack on the 19th of August on a busy market in Al-Bab city that killed at least 13 civilians, including 4 boys and 1 girl, and injured dozens of others. Ireland unequivocally condemns deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian harm resulting from indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks. International humanitarian law is clear. Any attack must comply with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions. We continue to see children in Syria paying a heavy price in the ongoing violence. We remind all parties that civilians must never be targeted, and we particularly deplore the impact of the violence on children. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to comply with their obligations under international law. There can be no military solution to the conflict in Syria. Mr. President, conditions for the safe, voluntary and dignified return of refugees remains to be fulfilled in Syria. Ireland believes it is imperative that host countries continue to uphold the principles of refugee protection. It is deeply regrettable that last month's 9th round of the Constitutional Committee did not go ahead, following the decision by the Syrian government not to participate. We reject any attempts to undermine the efforts of the Special Envoy to facilitate a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. We maintain that the Constitutional Committee should convene in Geneva as agreed by the delegations. We urge the Syrian government to put the best interests of the Syrian people first and to engage constructively with the Special Envoy and his efforts. Ireland recalls the European Union's position that there will be no normalisation with Damascus until an inclusive political solution in line with Resolution 2254 of this Council is firmly underway. We know the pivotal role that women have to play in building a sustainable, lasting peace for Syria. their full and meaningful participation in the political process must be enabled. Mr. President, Ireland will continue to support all efforts to pursue justice and accountability for crimes committed in Syria. Lasting peace in Syria is not possible without justice. Justice for Syrians includes the transparent and verifiable release of all those arbitrarily detained, as well as the provision of information on the fate and whereabouts of missing persons. We look forward to receiving the Secretary-General's report soon on this very important issue. In closing, I would like to acknowledge the work of civil society actors in Syria and note the importance of supporting and protecting them, particularly those who continue to document casualties and violations. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to make this statement on behalf of the 8 trees, namely Ghana, Kenya, and my country, Gabon. Allow us to start by expressing a warm welcome to our colleague from Ireland. We look forward to work together. I thank the Special Envoy, Geir Pedersen, and the Assistant Secretary General, Joyce Msuya, for their briefings on the latest development on the political humanitarian situation in Syria. We also welcome the participation of the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Republic of Turkey in this meeting. Mr. President, the A3 welcomes the appointment of the new Deputy Special Envoy for Syria, Mrs. Najet Roshdi, and wish her every success in her duty to support a political solution in Syria. We echo the appeal by the Special Envoy to the parties and the key stakeholders in the Syria conflict to shield the country from undue external pressures that could jeopardize peace and stability efforts. The parties and the stakeholders must instead strive to inject political life into the political process. They should demonstrate political maturity and commitment through constructive engagement and a return to the 9th session of the Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated small body of the Constitutional Committee meetings. On a positive note, we welcome the upcoming meeting of the Women's Advisory Body from August 29th to September 2nd in Geneva. We continue to commend the Special Envoy's useful exchanges with this critical group that represents the perspectives of the wide spectrum of Syrian women. The A3 recalls the amnesty decree announced by the government on April 30th. Political will remains an imperative for resolving the issue of detainees and the forcibly disappeared, particularly women and the elderly. Meaningful progress in this regard will build confidence and create an environment for the political process to move forward. It will also contribute positively to the Special Envoy's step-for-step approach. Mr. President, we are concerned about security situation in Syria. In fact, this country continues to be the scene of military clashes, particularly in the north of the country. In a context marked by a worsening humanitarian situation exacerbated by the continuing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, it also remains the center for peace-damaging rivalries and competition for influence among major powers. In this regard, the A3 are alarmed by the worsening levels of insecurity as demonstrated by incidents including continued airstrikes and rocket attacks in the northwest, which has resulted in civilian casualties. Unfortunately, it is civilians who continue to pay the heaviest price as violence continues to escalate in the country. The Secretary General's 80th report on the parties' implementation of the relevant Security Council resolution document incidents, in which 87 civilians were killed, including 15 women and 25 children. At the same time, at least 104 civilians were injured, including 16 women and 33 children. The rising levels and escalation of violence will only undermine any peace efforts. We therefore underscore the urgent need for de-escalation and restraint by all parties, as well as respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria by all players. We note with interest that the Syrian conflict continues to have a gendered impact, with women and girls being greatly affected. It is deeply worrying that aside reports of sexual violence visited on women in the Ahol camp, as much as 77% of the 26 victims of murders in the camp are women. Therefore, we call for protection that considers this difference in needs. The economic crisis in the country is making it more difficult for Syrians who face many challenges, such as access to water, health, electricity supply, inflation, and insufficient funding. This forces people to adopt harmful and irreversible coping mechanisms to survive. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains alarming, with more than half of the population in need of humanitarian assistance. The delivery of this aid still requires recourse to the cross-border humanitarian aid mechanism. In this regard, we continue to commend the ongoing cross-border operation, which remains a crucial lifeline for humanitarian assistance. We similarly commend the 6 convoys so far the past year of cross-line deliveries to the northwest of Syria, and salute the planned inclusion of medical supplies in the cross-line cooperation to the northeast of the country. Moreover, we call for more support to early recovery and livelihoods activities as a key component to building resilience and to the longer-term peace that Syria and the region need. Mr. President, we reiterate that there is no military solution to the Syrian crisis. Sustainable solution should be found in a frank dialogue involving all components of society, including women. We therefore reiterate our call to the parties to exercise restraint and commit to settle their differences by peaceful means, including through negotiation under the coordination of the Special Envoy. We encourage the efforts of regional and international actors to achieve political stability in Syria, while respecting the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the country. The A3 stand in solidarity with the people of Syria in their quest for lasting peace. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish to thank Geir Pedersen and Joyce Musuya for their briefings and for their action, and I thank their work of their teams for the benefit of peace in Syria and for the benefit of the protection of civilians in Syria. First of all, I'd like to make 3 points. First of all, the political process. The political process is taken hostage. Indeed, Russia continues to paralyze the political process by offering the Syrian regime a pretext not to participate in the meetings of the Constitutional Committee. They are invoking outlandish concerns regarding the location of the meeting. However, the terms of reference are clear. It is in Geneva that the Constitutional Committee's meetings must be held. After 11 years of conflict, no political solution in accordance with the provisions of Resolution 2254, which was nevertheless unanimously adopted, is materializing. However, that political solution is necessary for peace in Syria. And that is why both French and European positions regarding the lifting of sanctions, normalisation and reconstruction remain unchanged. Second point, humanitarian aid. The renewal of the cross-border humanitarian aid mechanism for 6 months with a single border crossing point remained largely insufficient given the extent of humanitarian needs. We will be working tirelessly in next January to ensure that this vital mechanism is renewed for a year. We wish to see progress in terms of cross-line access continue. However, we need to remain aware of the fact that even if cross-line convoys were regularly deployed, they could not replace cross-border operations. These cross-border operations have made it possible to dispatch 1,200 lorries in June and July, as was explained in the briefings. I call upon all parties, in particular the Syrian regime, to remember the fact that they must protect civilians and guarantee full humanitarian access. The respect of international humanitarian law is a responsibility of us all. Now, impunity. France will continue its fight against impunity in Syria. The Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs has received an important document regarding possible crimes committed by regime forces during the Tadamon massacre in 2013, the alleged events, which could constitute the most serious international crimes, have been brought to the attention of the National Anti-Terrorist Prosecutor, which has jurisdiction in France for crimes against humanity and war crimes. We hail the courage of human rights defenders whose determined work has made it possible to collect this documentation. This documentation comes in addition to the unfortunately already copious load of documentation accounting violence weathered by Syrians. I'll give you two examples. The Caesar report or UN reports detailing the systematic use of sexual violence by the regime. Those responsible for these crimes must be held accountable for their actions. That is also a sine qua non for any lasting peace in Syria. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of France for her statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of India.
I join others in thanking Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and ASG Masuya for their respective briefings. I also extend a warm welcome to the new Irish ambassador on his first day in the Security Council. It is disappointing that the small body of the Constitutional Committee has not met this month. We had hoped that the three parties would engage constructively and purposefully with a sense of compromise to achieve credible progress in the meeting. Now it seems that there's a question mark on the venue as well. Mr. President, external factors have proved detrimental to the overall political process. The engagement so far has not been able to bridge the trust deficit amongst the key stakeholders. The cancellation of the 9th Constitutional Committee meeting in July 2022 has further reinforced this view. As the July negotiations for renewal of the cross-border mechanism on the humanitarian track have demonstrated, entrenched vested positions by the primary stakeholders can be counterproductive in the long run and detrimental to the interests of millions of Syrians. We reiterate that it is for the Syrians to decide what is best for Syria and their own future. The Special Envoy has been making efforts to engage with all sides and facilitate the political process in line with Resolution 2254. We believe that his efforts should be supported, particularly his step-by-step approach. In this context, we welcome his recent visit to Moscow and meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov. We hope that he will be able to visit Damascus soon and also engage with the Syrian government. We continue to believe that the success of his efforts will also depend on actual relief to the people of Syria by an easing of measures affecting their daily lives. There is also an urgent need to scale up assistance and to ensure that humanitarian agencies receive the necessary funding to fully execute their plans. India has been consistent in calling for support to regional efforts in finding a long-term solution to the conflict. We have welcomed the progressive normalization of Syria's relations with its Arab neighbors. Any acts compromising Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity will have a negative impact on the political process. On the security front, we remain concerned with the overall situation in Syria. As pointed out in the Secretary General's 60-day report, violence has continued in the Idlib de-escalation area in the northwest of Syria, including through airstrikes, mutual shelling, and clashes. There is an urgent need for serious attempts towards a comprehensive nationwide ceasefire in Syria. We believe that withdrawal of all foreign forces is essential towards realizing this objective. India has been consistently cautioning against the looming threat posed by a resurgence of terrorist groups in Syria. UN-designated terrorist groups such as ISIL and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham continue to gain in strength, not just in Syria, but in Iraq as well. The global fight against terrorism cannot and should not be compromised for narrow political gains. The credibility of the international community's collective fight against terrorism can be strengthened only by ensuring accountability of terrorists and terrorist groups. Turning to the humanitarian dimension, the extension of the mandate for cross-border humanitarian assistance in July 2022 was indeed a welcome development. The fact that the Council was able to adopt a resolution on Syria is in itself a significant development. It is also important to note that elected Council members played an important bridging role in finding solutions towards long-running problems and conflicts. The resolution reassured nearly 4 million people in the northwest of Syria, 2.7 million of whom are IDPs, many of whom are women and children, that the world remained engaged with them and is concerned with their well-being. At the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that more than 14.5 million people across Syria need humanitarian assistance in one form or the other, while essential food items and fuel continue to remain in short supply. Food insecurity has reached historic highs, and an estimated 60% of the population is food insecure per the UN, even as the conflict enters its 12th year. India continues to call for enhanced and effective humanitarian assistance to all Syrians throughout the country, without discrimination, without politicization, and without preconditions. While cross-border operations are predictable and important, they cannot continue to exist in perpetuity. Concrete steps need to be taken to address the hurdles that are obstructing the functioning of cross-line operations. Mr. President, humanitarian assistance cannot be a matter of political expediency. Linking humanitarian and developmental assistance with progress in the political process will only exacerbate humanitarian suffering. The international community also needs to constructively look at promoting projects which will bring the much-needed jobs and economic opportunities for the Syrian people. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me underline India's sustained commitment to extending development assistance and human resource development support to the people of Syria. Our continued support to Syria in its endeavor for seeking lasting peace and stability remains steadfast and unwavering. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President. I make this statement on the political situation in Syria in my national capacity. And I thank you, Special Envoy Peterson, for your briefing on the latest updates. President, we remain concerned by the troubling security situation, in particular recent escalations in northern Syria. The attack on 18 August in al-Hasakeh and on 19 August in the market in al-Bab city resulted in numerous civilians killed and injured, including children. These attacks are unacceptable and only add to the immense suffering of the civilian population. We urge all parties to demonstrate restraint and abide by their obligations to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Furthermore, we urge all parties involved to contribute to lowering tensions. President, once again, we are reminded of the urgency of a nationwide ceasefire and reinvigorated efforts to find a political solution. It is therefore particularly disappointing that the 9th session of the Syrian Constitutional Committee has not been held. Progress towards finding a sustainable end to the conflict must be a priority for all, and we urge all parties to cooperate constructively with the Special Envoy and convene again as soon as possible. Norway will continue supporting the work of the Special Envoy, the implementation of Resolution 2254, and the Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process. Finally, President, let me underline the importance of making progress on the issue of detainees and missing persons in Syria. So many Syrians and their families are personally affected by this issue and do not know what happened to their loved ones. We're therefore troubled to hear that there has been little progress in implementing the amnesty since April. And we urge the Syrian authorities to share more information and build confidence on progress towards implementation of the amnesty. Movement on this file is essential for breaking through the current political stalemate. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, at the outset, I thank Mr. Geir-Pedersen and Ms. Masuya for their thorough briefings. Our meeting today comes at a time when the political process in Syria is going through a state of stagnation and the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. Not to mention, there are numerous difficult security challenges that raise many questions and concerns regarding the next stage of the conflict and the fate of the Syrian people who have suffered immensely for over a decade. In the past few months, there was an opportunity to make progress in the meetings of the Constitutional Committee, marking an essential step forward in the political track. However, we regret the events that took place and led to the cancellation of the 9th round of meetings due to geopolitical reasons. It begs the question, how long will Syria remain a playground for settling political scores of which the Syrian people are the primary victims? Thus, in the coming period, it is critical to mobilize momentum for a return to the talks. This first requires the international community to stop linking the Syrian file to other political files. Second, to provide its support for the mediation efforts led by the Special Envoy aimed at building confidence between the parties. We reiterate here our rejection of foreign intervention in Syria to preserve its unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We believe that there is no military solution to the Syrian crisis. Reaching a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, peaceful solution is the only way to end the crisis and address the root causes of all its humanitarian, economic, and security ramifications in a suitable manner that meets the aspirations of the Syrian people to achieve stability, security, and prosperity. Mr. President, we express our concern over the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria. Women and children bear the greatest burden as a result of these conditions, and millions of people continue to suffer from a shortage of clean and safe water. Furthermore, acute food insecurity has reached unprecedented levels, affecting more than 12 million Syrians. Providing electricity to Syrians also remains an urgent need, which requires intensified efforts to achieve this goal in line with the recent Security Council Resolution 2642. As the Secretary General's report indicates, hundreds of thousands of residents receive only 1 hour of electricity per day. Electricity is provided in public service facilities such as hospitals and schools for only 8 hours a day in approximately half of the country's regions. This greatly impacts the living conditions of Syrians. In light of the current situation, we must ask ourselves, how long will the Syrian people suffer from these dire humanitarian conditions? We welcome the passage of the 6th cross-line humanitarian aid convoy to northwest Syria earlier this month. We regret the development mentioned by Ms. Masulia regarding the postponement of the cross-line mission to Ras Al Ain, despite having all the necessary approvals. As such, we continue to emphasize the need to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid to all those in need in all areas without obstacles or politicization. We should also ensure that this assistance responds to the specific needs of women and girls, especially their health needs. The continued delay in addressing the political situation deepens the existing security vacuum that is already exploited by terrorist groups in the country such as Daesh. In addition to the threats posed by other terrorist groups, the report of the Secretary General confirms that Daesh continues in its attempts to recruit fighters, mobilize weapons, and develop its combat capabilities to extend its influence over Syrian territory. These groups constitute a grave threat not only to the security and stability of Syria, but to the entire region. Again, we must ask ourselves, how long will terrorist groups continue to exploit the Syrian crisis to spread their own agenda in the region? Mr. President, ending the Syrian crisis and its security, economic, and humanitarian repercussions is not far-fetched. It is possible if efforts are focused on breaking the current stalemate in the political track. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefers for their presentations. My delegation would like to focus on 3 points. The first is on the humanitarian situation in Syria. The second on the political process. And the final point lies at the intersection between humanitarian and political aspects. Firstly, the delivery of humanitarian assistance. The cross-border mechanism authorized by Resolution 2642 has an expiration date, as was the case of every prior authorization. The mechanism, a temporary arrangement, was necessary to respond to urgent humanitarian needs of millions of vulnerable Syrians. We now have 5 months ahead of us before the latest cross-border authorization expires. The Council must seize this time to seriously measure and document the results of the cross-border mechanism. At the same time, a genuine assessment of what is holding back cross-line deliveries is needed. Brazil understands that cross-border humanitarian assistance is not a long-term solution. Eventually, it will need to be phased out in the context of a solution that allows for the Syrian Arab Republic to take full responsibility for the provision of aid to its population. In the meantime, we encourage efforts to increase cross-line deliveries which are able to reach other parts of the Syrian territory. On the political process in Syria, our second point, it is deeply concerning that the UN-facilitated dialogue under the auspices of the Constitutional Committee has made virtually no progress over the past few years. Brazil continues to believe in the importance of the United Nations to facilitate the necessary Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process to end the conflict in Syria. Whereas there should be flexibility in terms of the format of UN facilitation efforts, including on the venues for the talks, these should still be in line with the principles set out by Resolution 2258 and leave it for Syrians to decide on their political future. Brazil's position remains unchanged. Only a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, UN-facilitated political process with due regard for the preservation of Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty can offer a lasting solution for this conflict. Our third and final point relates to the interplay between politics and the humanitarian crisis in Syria. The sanctions imposed against the Syrian government have had grave consequences for the Syrian population, despite humanitarian waivers. Such measures continue to exacerbate the hardship of all Syrians, adversely impacting the provision of humanitarian assistance and restricting the recovery of basic infrastructure and services in the country, including early recovery projects whose importance Resolution 2642 has acknowledged. Brazil reiterates the importance of conducting a thorough assessment of the potential deleterious consequences of unilateral sanctions on the civilian populations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Assistant Secretary General Suya for their briefings. We also welcome the participation of the delegations of Syria, Iran, and Turkey in this session. Mexico has taken note of the joint statement issued by the summit held in Tehran last July. We recognize the importance of dialogue between some of the key stakeholders to resolve the situation in Syria. My country also regrets the fact that the 9th meeting of the small body of the Constitutional Committee has not yet been able to take place. We also agree with the Special Envoy on the importance of ensuring that other conflicts do not negatively impact upon these negotiations which are so necessary if we are to forge ahead with a credible and inclusive political process on the basis of Resolution 2254. This progress is vital to put an end to the deep humanitarian and political crisis, which is the result of 11 years of conflict. We trust that it will soon be possible to overcome the impasse and that it will soon be possible to convene the meeting of the Constitutional Committee. We also hope that that meeting will produce substantive agreements, and we trust that that will be the case. Hand in hand with the constitutional process, priority attention must be given to the situation of detained and missing persons, which the Special Envoy referred to. Principally, efforts must be stepped up to shed light on cases of forced disappearance, and efforts must be stepped up to continue with the release of arbitrarily detained persons. To achieve this goal, humanitarian organizations must have access to detention centers. Efforts in terms of accountability must also continue. As such, we reiterate the importance of cooperation with the IIIM for the investigation of cases of systematic violations of international law. Mr. President, my delegation observes with dismay that hostilities have significantly increased in many areas of Syrian territory, primarily in the north of Aleppo, in Manbij, Ain Issa, and Tal Tamr. This situation creates an even bigger cost for the civilian population, which has been trapped in this reality for more than a decade now. The nationwide ceasefire is urgent to avoid more civilian losses and damage to the fragile existing infrastructure. In addition to this current state of affairs, there is the trend in food security, which is of increasing concern, as indicated by the early warnings issued by the WFP and the FAO. Harvest forecasts are not encouraging, and this was already stated by the ASG. And in addition, there is inflation, the volatility of international markets, and the energy crisis. In the face of the increasingly critical food situation, it is crucial to maintain all access modalities for humanitarian assistance. As such, we welcome the 6th cross-line humanitarian aid convoy, which succeeded in benefiting more than 43,000 people in the northwest. We also saw the 2.4 million people that received assistance through the cross-border aid mechanisms. At the same time as we strengthen the cross-line modality, existing needs reaffirm the need to renew the cross-border mechanism in January, because needs will increase during winter. As regards the northeast region, we express concern at and condemn the violence which continues to prevail in Al-Hol. In particular, we note that this violence has a direct impact on the provision of humanitarian assistance and services. The disruption of healthcare services and humanitarian services in general simply serves to make living conditions all the more intolerable. Mr. President, we recall that 94% of the people in Al-Hol are women, girls, and boys. This camp is quite clearly no place for children. Mexico expresses concern at the children that remain deprived of their liberty and at the many detention centres. As such, we reiterate our appeal for priority to be given to the repatriation and reintegration of nationals from other countries. To conclude, Mr. President, we take note of the military actions in the east of Syria, which have taken place through the invocation of Article 51 of the Charter. We reiterate that for Mexico, in line with that provision, invoking self-defense to make use of force against non-state actors in a third state on the premise of the so-called unwilling and unable doctrine is counter to the United Nations Charter and in customary international law. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I thank the representative of Mexico for her statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Let me first express our sincere condolences to the Pakistani government and people for the terrible human toll and outspread destruction due to one of the worst flooding the country is experiencing. We stand in full solidarity with the Pakistanis and join their call for international help and solidarity. We remain convinced that climate change and its effects constitute a direct security threat and deserve proper and continued attention by this Council. Mr. President, if there were a perfectly suited situation where to use the sentence "no end in sight," that would certainly be Syria. After 11 long years of continued brutality, killings, forced displacement of civilians, destruction of civil infrastructure, and atrocities of all kinds continue unabated. Only in the last 2 months, verified incidents have led to more than 80 civilians killed and more than 100 civilians injured, many of them women and children. Lack of respect for basic norms and rights, especially protection of civilians, persists with impunity. Mr. President, as we heard, humanitarian needs throughout Syria are at the highest level. These huge and increasing needs demonstrate once more the vital importance of cross-border mechanism that the Council renewed last month. We urge the Council not to politicize this humanitarian mandate and work for its smooth renewal in January 2023 in order to provide the necessary certainty and predictability for the aid workers to do their job and reflect the real needs on the ground in order to expand access to life-saving aid across the country, as well as through all modalities, including, of course, cross-line deliveries. Mr. President, the humanitarian crisis continues to deepen because the political transition is paralyzed. We deplore the actions of the Syrian regime and its supporters that prevented the holding of the 9th session of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva last month. Those who derail this process must know that they keep the country's future hostage. We support the Special Envoy Pedersen and his efforts to produce tangible results. His work is far from easy. Without general goodwill and good faith, the political process will go nowhere, and we call on all actors involved to support transition and to exert the necessary pressure on the parties to move forward. Mr. President, underneath the humanitarian catastrophe and the political paralysis lies the mountain of atrocities committed mainly by the Syrian regime and a cry for justice. More than 130,000 people are arbitrarily arrested, missing or forcefully disappeared. The anguish of nearly every Syrian family for their loved ones continues to be ignored. We support the creation of an independent mechanism with a strong international mandate to clarify the fate and whereabouts of missing people. We also expect full clarity and accurate data on the amnesty. As called by Ms. Msuya, the conditions in the Al-Hol camp where 55,000 people live, 94% of them women and children, continue to deteriorate. Only this year there have been 33 murders and 6 of them recently in June and July. A solution is urgently needed, including through repatriation of the detainees. Residents of the Rubkan camp continue to live in dire conditions with limited access to basic services, and we support efforts by UN agencies to get access in order to reach those there. Mr. President, Protection of civilians, international humanitarian law, and human rights law must be ensured by parties to the conflict. It is not an option, it is an obligation. Impunity for serious violations and abuses of human rights and serious violations of international humanitarian law remain a grave concern. Accountability for serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law is crucial to achieving sustainable peace based on an inclusive political solution in accordance with Resolution 2254. This will require a credible justice, a genuine reconciliation process. Lasting peace will only be achieved if human rights are respected. Mr. President, let me end by highlighting that the people of Syria need food, they need protection and security, but they also need a perspective. We echo the calls for the implementation of a nationwide ceasefire, which would feed into efforts for a genuine political process to open a new chapter for Syrians, to build their future, a future for all, with hope and in freedom. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, President. And thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and ASG Musia, for your sobering briefings. Let me join others in welcoming our new Irish colleague, Ambassador Fergal Maithen, to the Council. The United Kingdom continues to stand with the Syrian people in their desire for a sustainable solution to the Syrian conflict. As we've said many times, the only way to achieve this is through the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. This includes a nationwide ceasefire, unhindered aid access, release of the arbitrarily detained, conditions for safe, voluntary and dignified refugee return, and free and fair elections pursuant to a new constitution. Special Envoy Pedersen's ongoing efforts to deliver 2254 have our full support. We are disappointed that the regime continues to stall discussions on political and constitutional reform. We are also disappointed that Russia is further undermining political progress in Syria by asserting that Geneva should no longer be the venue for what should be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned constitutional committee talks. While the Syrian regime continues to fail in its responsibility to respect the basic rights of Syrians, provide for their needs, or engage in the political process, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. Currently, around 14.6 million Syrians require humanitarian assistance, more than 67% of the population. 12 million are facing acute food insecurity this year. The United Kingdom recognises that early recovery is necessary to address humanitarian need. This is reflected in our support. Our funding has helped the rehabilitation of water networks, provided agricultural training and inputs for livestock and vegetable production, and provided apprenticeships and small business grants to help create jobs. But humanitarian assistance, and particularly cross-border assistance, remains a lifeline for millions. By reducing the UN cross-border mandate from 12 to 6 months, Resolution 2642 has caused uncertainty for the UN and its partners, impacting humanitarian operations and early recovery programming, a priority avowedly shared by Russia, as well as other Council members. We therefore call on all Security Council members to work together to ensure a renewed agreement this January to meet the critical needs of the Syrian people. Further uncertainty or a closing of this lifeline at the height of winter would be catastrophic for millions of people. Thank you.
Okay.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. I thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and ASG Joyce Msuya for their briefings. I'd like to briefly highlight 5 points. First, Violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be brought to an end. Respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity is an important principle enshrined in the UN Charter and a cornerstone of international relations. The provisions of the UN Charter are not mere quotable quotes good for lip service. They are not optional, good for selective application, and they certainly do not lend themselves to misinterpretation or misapplication. There's no doubt that the recent US military operations in eastern Syria constitute a violation of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity and have nothing to do with the right to self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter. The unlawful presence of foreign forces and unlawful military operations in Syria must end. Second, it is imperative to combat all terrorists with all manner of terrorism with zero tolerance. Terrorist organizations such as Daesh, HTS, and the ETIM remain rampant in Syria, posing continued threats to international peace and security. It has been reported repeatedly that some of the terrorist organizations designated by the Council still have access to various forms of funding. Terrorism is terrorism, full stop. And any connivance, shielding, or politically motivated utilization of terrorist forces is like rearing ferocious tigers, which would only lead to further perils. The international community must work in synergy to combat all forms of terrorism and all terrorist activities. Third, we must stay the course in the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. The only path to a political solution lies in letting the Syrian people decide the future of their country by themselves in the absence of any external interference. China supports the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen to encourage and facilitate continued consultations and forge consensus among intra-Syrian parties. We welcome the important signals that the Astana process recently sent out on supporting the political process in Syria. We note the announcement by the Syrian government that local council elections will be held in September, and we hope they will be held successfully. Fourth, the transition of cross-border humanitarian operations to cross-line deliveries must be accelerated. Since the adoption of Resolution 2642, only one cross-line operation has been completed in northwestern Syria, with no significant improvements in terms of both efficiency and scale. We wish to register our profound disappointment at this. I'd like to reiterate that cross-border relief was a temporary arrangement made under exceptional circumstances, and that the transition to cross-line operations needs to shift into a higher gear with a clear timetable in place for the eventual termination of cross-border relief. At the same time, there is a need to vigorously promote early recovery projects throughout Syria, mobilize the international community to provide adequate financial support with no strings attached, promote the early operationalization of more projects, and nurture Syria's domestic capacity and drivers for its economic development. Fifth, the unilateral sanctions against Syria and illegal plundering of its resources must stop. Economic recovery and development is the ultimate means by which Syria can lift itself out of the humanitarian crisis. However, for a long time, unilateral sanctions have disrupted the lifelines of Syria's economic recovery and development, and the illegal plundering means the resources crucial to Syria's economic recovery and development have been stolen, causing incalculable damage to the Syrian people. A case in point is oil. 83% of Syria's daily oil production is being illegally sold out of the country, with oil smuggling convoys forming long queues at illegal border crossings. The international community must not turn a blind eye to such practices, and the Security Council should unequivocally call for a cessation of these activities. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor, in line with Rule 30 7 of the Rules of Procedure, I now give the floor to the representatives invited to this meeting. I first give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me the floor. And as I am speaking for the first time during your presidency of the Security Council for this month, I'd like to congratulate you on your successful presidency. And I would like to thank your predecessor, His Excellency the Ambassador of Brazil, for his successful and distinguished presidency of the Council last month. Mr. President, we have listened to the briefings given by Mr. Geert Peterson and Ms. Joyce Msuya, and we would like to make the following points. The government of the Syrian Arab Republic is exerting great efforts to promote national reconciliation and to provide the conditions for a dignified life for its people and to rehabilitate infrastructure and basic services provided to the population and to rebuild what was destroyed by terrorism. We're working on securing the conditions necessary for a voluntary, safe, and dignified return by the refugees to their areas of residence. The Security Council's adoption of Resolution 2642 was an additional step taken towards improving and enhancing the delivery of humanitarian aid to those who need it, and towards offering support to basic services. It has also constituted an additional step towards expanding the reach of humanitarian activity, including through supporting early recovery projects, especially in the field of electric power, which is a vital sector and an indispensable one to other basic services sectors such as health, education, and water. Today, and almost 2 months since the Security Council's adoption of Resolution 2642, our delegation looks forward to the Council guaranteeing the full implementation of this resolution and to holding an informal and interactive dialogue that would review and follow the implementation of this resolution, including the progress achieved in the early recovery projects. Moreover, our delegation hopes that this mechanism would be able to identify the flaws and gaps that the implementation of this resolution witnesses, and it would be able to determine the reasons for them, and it hopes that countries would be able to take responsibility for their decisions in a manner that would be constructive in the implementation of this resolution. The government of Syria and its partners in the United Nations and its humanitarian agencies continue to face great difficulties and challenges in their efforts to raise the humanitarian situation and the living standards of the Syrian people because of the following. First, the countries of the West continue to politicize humanitarian and development work, and they continue to violate the guidelines that govern such work. Second, some donor states have disavowed their pledges to support humanitarian work and their obligations to offer the necessary funding to such work, including through the implementation of early recovery projects stipulated by Security Council Resolution 2642. The Syrian humanitarian response, until this very day, has only fulfilled a very small part of the funding that is required. Third, the United States and its Western allies continue to impose and expand unilateral coercive measures that are inhumane and are illegitimate and which cause untold suffering among the Syrian people because of a severe shortage in food and in medicine and in fuel and other basic supplies that affect all aspects of the Syrian people's lives. Number 4. The U.S. occupying forces continue to plunder the wealth of the Syrian people, including wheat, oil, gas, and cotton. 66,000 barrels a day are of Syrian oil are stolen daily. And over the past few days, more than 500 trucks laden with stolen Syrian oil left Syria to American bases in Iraq. Mr. President, the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, and out of its concern to make sure that humanitarian aid reaches those that need it throughout Syria without any discrimination, our government has offered all facilitations to the United Nations to improve and to enhance the delivery of humanitarian aid. However, the terrorist organizations that are rampant in northwestern Syria and those who support it continue to obstruct our efforts to deliver this aid. Since Resolution 2642 was adopted and until today, international attention remained focused on the cross-border mechanism. Over 1,000 trucks have crossed the borders. In order to justify the continuation of this mechanism and to guarantee the continued flow of supplies to the terrorist organizations in that area. Mr. President, landmines and exploding ammunition left behind by the terrorist organizations continue to pose a grave threat to the lives of Syrians, especially children. The lack of achievement in the removal of these landmines and exploding ammunitions has prevented Syrians from returning to their homes, to their farms, to their jobs and schools. Moreover, they continue to obstruct the delivery of vital humanitarian aid. According to the Secretary General's report, Syria is one of the countries with the highest reported number of direct victims of landmines and exploding ammunition in the world. My delegation calls on the United Nations to give this issue the attention and importance it deserves, and to move from raising awareness of the dangers of these landmines and explosives to drawing up a comprehensive plan for field work within a clear time frame to clear all areas in Syria of these landmines and explosive ammunition, and in a manner that would help save the lives of Syrians and provide the necessary conditions for the safe return of displaced persons and refugees to their homes so that they are able to live a normal life here. I would like to note that the government of Syria has succeeded, thanks to its own efforts and thanks to the support of its allies and friends, has succeeded in resettling over 2,400,000 Syrian citizens to their places of permanent residence. Mr. President, the Russian Federation and the Islamic Republic of Iran in the Tehran Conference Summit of the 19th of July 2022, they renewed their firm commitment to Syria's sovereignty and independence and its territorial integrity and unity, and to the goals and purposes of the United Nations Charter. They reiterated their rejection of secessionist plots that aim to undermine the sovereignty of Syria. They condemned the repeated Israeli aggressions. Moreover, the Tehran summit also saw an expression of the determination to continue working to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. The summit reiterated that the only solution in Syria is through a political process that is led and owned by Syrians and facilitated by the United Nations. Mr. President, putting an end to the illegitimate foreign presence in Syrian territories and all the connected terrorist organizations and secessionist militias, putting an end to the repeated Israeli attacks, the systematic attacks against the sovereignty of Syria, putting an end immediately and unconditionally to the policies of economic terrorism and collective punishment imposed by the United States of America and the European Union on the Syrian people, are the only way to guarantee respect for the sovereignty of Syria, its independence, and its territorial unity and integrity. It is the only way to eliminate the remnants of terrorist organizations and related entities and groupings. It is the only way to put an end to all forms of demographic change and eviction, and it is the only way to give Syrians back their national economic resources. Syria demands the states that sponsor armed groups and separatist militias that plunder Syrian wealth. We demand that they pay reparations to the Syrian people, because plundering these national resources is a violation of international law. Mr. President, before I end my statement, I would like to respond to the representative of the United States of America and what he said, as he attempted to justify the attacks that were launched by his country's forces in Deir ez-Zor governorate. I'd like to clarify to the distinguished members of the Security Council that the U.S. forces are illegally present in Syrian territory without the request or consent of the government of the Syrian Arab Republic. Therefore, their presence is illegal, and this in itself is a blatant violation of the Charter of the United Nations and international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, which underline the need to respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. The justification made by the representative of the U.S. occupying forces and using the excuse of Article 51 of the Charter and what he called the right to self-defense is an attempt at legal misguidance and is politically out of line. This U.S. justification can be described by the Arab saying, which is an excuse is more horrendous than the actual act. I thank you, Mr. President.
Okay. I thank the statement by the Syrian representative. I'll give the floor to the representative of Iran.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Mr. President, I thank the UN Special Envoy and the Assistant Secretary General for their briefings. The humanitarian situation in Syria remains dire, and the country's economic crisis continues to affect the people across the country. The provision of humanitarian aid is essential, and political circumstances should not be allowed to prevent humanitarian aid to reach the people in need. This must, however, be done with full respect for Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity. We welcome the adoption of Resolution 2642 and consider it an important step toward addressing Syria's urgent needs. The resolution expressly calls for early recovery projects and greater transparency in relief efforts. Furthermore, it emphasizes the critical importance of increasing cross-line delivery throughout Syria. Mr. President, the UN's first report on the implementation of the resolution emphasizes the importance of early recovery projects and claims that the lack of electricity has made it more difficult to access necessary basic services. According to the report, limited access to electricity has also hampered the provision of essential humanitarian services and other response activities, including the provisions of hospital and clinic services, food production, and water distribution. Given the severity of the situation, early recovery projects, such as electricity projects, are critical in reestablishing access to essential services and must not be affected by unilateral sanctions. In this regard, the resolution's provisions and content are explicit, leaving no room for arbitrary interpretation or self-reading. We demand that the resolution be fully and effectively implemented. We also demand that unilateral sanctions against Syria be lifted, as they are impeding the resolution's implementation. Mr. President, we trust that the special report of the Secretary General requested by Resolution 2642 will include general trends regarding unimpeded and secure United Nations cross-line operations, which should reach all of Syria, as well as early recovery projects and accurate information on the humanitarian assistance provided through the United Nations humanitarian cross-border operations, including their transparency and the distribution mechanism. Furthermore, an informal interactive dialogue of the Security Council, as set out in the resolution, to review and monitor the implementation of this resolution on a regular basis could be an appropriate mechanism to allow the Council to keep track of how the resolution is being implemented effectively and fairly. Mr. President, regarding the political process, we would like to reiterate our steadfast position that the Syrian crisis must be resolved peacefully and in accordance with the principles of international law, particularly the full respect of national sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. In order to achieve this goal, the occupation must end and Syria's full sovereignty must be restored. We highlight the Constitutional Committee's crucial role in the political resolution on the Syrian crisis, and we commend and support the UN Special Envoy's efforts to interact with the Syrian parties in order to facilitate the work of committee's 9th session. In this regard, we highlight the tripartite summit with the framework of the Astana format held in Tehran on 19 July 2022, where the presidents of the Astana format guarantors emphasized their unwavering commitments to the Syrian Arab Republic's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity, and the advancement of a sustainable political process led and owned by the Syrian people in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. They also emphasized the Constitutional Committee's critical role and reaffirmed their willingness to support ongoing interactions between its member and the Special Envoy for Syria as a facilitator in order to ensure long-term stability and effective work of the next sessions of the committee. Mr. President, the Israeli regime continues to violate Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as carry out terrorist attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure within Syrian territory. According to the UN report, the Damascus International Airport was forced to close due to the damage caused by the Israeli terrorist attacks on 10th June. All flights for the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service, which is run by the World Food Programme and is the primary enabler of access for humanitarian operations in the country, have been cancelled as a result of this criminal act. We strongly condemn the continuing Israeli military attacks in Syria, including on civilian infrastructure, and recognize Syria's legitimate right to self-defense under international law and the United Nations Charter. The continuation of such criminal acts will destabilize and exacerbate tensions in the region. The Security Council must abandon its double standard and condemn unequivocally Israeli aggressions and terrorist attacks on Syria's territory, which are being pursued in flagrant violation of the UN Charter and international law, particularly the principle of a sovereign state's territorial integrity and independence. And finally, Mr. President, my delegation categorically rejects the unfounded accusation made by the representative of the United States against my country at this meeting. Indeed, the United States' presence in the northeast of Syria under the pretext of combating terrorism is a clear violation of the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. It is the United States that is working with the terrorist groups in Syria and destabilizing the peace and security in the region. The United States must cease its violation of international law and the UN Charter by ending its continuing support of terrorist groups and occupation of the northeast part of Syria. The Security Council should live up its charter mandate and demand the U.S. honor its international obligations. Iran, as a responsible state and in line with its international obligation, continues its efforts to assist the Syrian government to combat terrorism. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Iran for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and ASG Misuya for their briefings. Let me start by emphasizing that it is vital to accelerate efforts for a political solution in Syria. On its part, Turkey, from the very beginning, have been supporting every effort towards a political solution that will ensure a united Syria, free, safe, and democratic. We have played a constructive and leading role in all initiatives that aim to reach a lasting solution as soon as possible. At the forefront of these efforts is the political process based on UN Security Council Resolution 2254. As we have underlined time and again, there is no way to end the Syrian conflict and offer a lasting settlement other than a political solution to be agreed upon by all the segments of the people of Syria. Mr. President, our longest land border is with Syria, 911 kilometers to be exact. Therefore, protection of the territorial integrity and unity of Syria is indispensable for us. Equally vital is the elimination of the threat posed by terrorist organizations to both Syria and Turkey. It is also crucial that Syrians are able to return to their homes in safety and peace, play a role in the future of their country, and contribute to its redevelopment and to the establishment of lasting peace. We believe that a political solution on the basis of these elements is not impossible if all segments of the Syrian society make sincere and constructive efforts. Turkey will not withhold its support towards this direction. The Syrian opposition has so far acted in good faith to contribute to the success of the political process. We will continue to encourage them in this direction. Throughout the 8 rounds of the Constitutional Committee, the opposition's positive approach was clearly seen and appreciated by the UN and other observers. However, progress can be made only if a similar approach is displayed by the regime. We hope that the 9th round will be held as soon as possible under the UN's facilitation with a result-oriented approach. Mr. President, eliminating the threat posed by terrorist organizations in Syria, primarily PKK-YPG and Daesh, requires joint efforts. Terrorist organization PKK-YPG continues to attack Syrian civilians as well as our citizens within our borders using the very weapons provided to them to fight Daesh. The so-called Syrian Democratic Forces SDF, which is actually nothing but PKK-YPG, carries out, on average, 100 terrorist attacks every month in northern Syria. In the last 2 years, around 500 Syrians have lost their lives in these attacks. Turkey's borders have been targeted more than 10 times in the last 2 years. Most recently, on 16th August, 2 Turkish soldiers were killed as a result of a mortar attack on our border, province of Şanlıurfa, launched from the area under the control of the SDF. No one should expect us to remain indifferent to these attacks. The countries that support PKK-YPG SDF, including those in this chamber, should understand that the main purpose of this terrorist organization is not to fight Daesh. It is separatist terrorism in Syria and Turkey. The images that the SDF shared from their social media accounts are not images of them fighting Daesh, but rather images of their attacks on Turkish security forces, accompanied by expressions full of hatred and hostility. These images, unfortunately, are no surprise to us, but we wonder if and how the supporters of PKK-YPG SDF are responding to them. Let me repeat again, the real fight against Daesh can and must only be carried out with legitimate actors. The mentality that a terrorist organization could be fought with the so-called help of another terrorist organization is fundamentally flawed and doomed to fail. Mr. President, as I have said time and again in this chamber, Turkey will continue its resolute fight against all terrorist organizations threatening its national security in exercise of its inherent right of self-defense as embodied in Article 51 of the UN Charter and in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions on the fight against terrorism. Our determination in this sense is also a guarantee for Syria's territorial integrity and political unity. Our past operations hampered the separatist agenda of the PKK-YPG terrorist organization. We are ready to cooperate with all actors that have a genuine interest and determination in the unity of Syria and in the fight against terrorism. Mr. President, the humanitarian crisis in Syria continues unabated, and other conflicts also negatively impact the already dire situation. It was disappointing, to say the least, that despite the strong calls from the UN and the humanitarian community for a 12-month extension, the Council had to settle with a 6-month renewal of this lifeline operation. We are glad that 4.1 million people living in northwest Syria are safe for now. But when the mandate of the cross-border mechanism comes to an end on January 10th, it will be in the dead of winter. This is literally the worst time one can think of to reconsider life-saving humanitarian support. It is critical that the cross-border mandate is extended once again in January, as indeed foreseen in Security Council Resolution 2642. We call on all relevant parties to act responsibly and support the Syrian people without discrimination. On our part, we will maintain our support to the UN and the international humanitarian community in providing cross-border assistance to Syria. As seen with the 6 cross-line aid deliveries to Idlib so far, Turkey provides the greatest support to the implementation of Security Council resolution. We will continue to do so. However, we are against arbitrary implementation of the resolution. Cross-line should continue, but it cannot be the ultimate aim. The ultimate aim is to deliver humanitarian aid. Ignoring cross-border deliveries and other parts of Syria cannot be justified by increasing the number of cross-line deliveries. We also expect the UN to officially report that the most important obstacle to the cross-line activities to Idlib is the non-stop ceasefire violations of the regime and its backers in this region. Just like in Ras Al Ain, where the negative attitude of the regime and its backers prevented planned cross-line deliveries. Mr. President, we are also having difficulty in understanding why both the UN and some donor countries are hesitant in extending aid to the opposition-controlled areas in Syria and implementing humanitarian assistance projects. The inaction in this regard cannot be justified by any of the excuses put forward. Selectivity and discrimination have no place in delivering humanitarian aid. In this regard, I would like to know the reasons why there is no cross-line delivery to Rukban camp. And we would like to request, once again, detailed information on the cross-line missions to northeast Syria. Finally, we wish to see real progress on the water issue in El Bab, which is left unaddressed for too long. The promise of access to Ain al-Baida came very late. We will follow this issue closely. Turkey will keep up to support all segments of the Syrian people without discrimination in humanitarian issues. We call on all other responsible actors to do the same. Mr. President, our support for a political solution in Syria, in line with the Resolution 2254 and acceptable to the people of Syria, will continue unabated. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I will now adjourn the meeting.